At 34, Miriam Holt stood in the street before the first snow with 2 children, 1 carpetbag, and nowhere in Juniper Crossing left to sleep. Harlan Creed, who owned the bank, the mercantile, and half the fear in town, had cast her out of her late husband's house because Thomas Holt's note had come due and the little place by the creek was worth more to him than a widow's winter. She had $3.82 stitched into her glove, and with 2 of those dollars she bought, at the county tax counter, an abandoned cabin on Widow's Bench above town, a weathered place so long forsaken that even the hunters called it a poor bargain and a fool's shelter. It was the sort of purchase people make only when pride has been thinned to thread and cold is already moving down from the peaks. But before the first fire was lit there, before the children had even finished shivering, she would find that something had been sealed inside that cabin for years, waiting for the right hands to break the silence around it, and what lay hidden there would not only alter her life, but bring a thirsty town back to itself. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Miriam Holt. That if you are listening from a place that feels overlooked or nearly forgotten, tell us where it is in the comments. Miriam had not been born to ease, but she had been born to usefulness, and on the frontier that was often the finer inheritance. Her father, Asa Bell, had raised cabins from green pine and cottonwood along the upper Arkansas, and her mother, Ruth, had taught letters in any room with a table, 3 chairs, and enough patience to share between them. So the girl grew up among boards, nails, lamp smoke, hymn scraps, and weather, learning early that a house was not only a shelter but a memory arranged into walls. Her father taught her to read grain and timber the way other men read cards, to know where a beam would split, where it would hold, and how a floor would complain before it gave way. Her mother taught her that written things were often stronger than shouted ones, that a carefully kept ledger might outlast a proud man's temper, and that names, dates, and witness marks mattered because the world forgot poor people first. When other girls were taught to keep their hands pretty, Miriam was taught to keep hers steady. She could patch a roof, set a kettle hook, mend a sleeve, square a window, and copy a deed in a hand so clear a judge could not pretend not to understand it. By the time she was 19, she had the composed manner of those who know how much work stands between dawn and dark, and she married Thomas Holt not because he dazzled a room, but because he never took more space than his own honest shape required. He hauled freight in good weather, cut timber in bad, and laughed softly, as if laughter were another resource one ought not to waste. Together they came to Juniper Crossing in the middle years of the 1890s, when the town still believed in itself. It sat in a bowl of tawny hills and blue distance, with wagon ruts for streets, a church that rang more bravely than beautifully, a schoolhouse that smelled of chalk and coal, and a creek people spoke of with the old familiarity of kin. They built a 2-room house with a lean-to kitchen on a strip near the willow bank, and because Miriam had helped frame it, she knew every sound it made. She knew how the front step answered rain, how the stovepipe sang on wind-heavy nights, how the pantry shelf tilted ever so slightly if the flour bin was too full. Their Clara was born with solemn gray eyes, and their little Eli came red-faced and indignant, as though he had already found the world poorly arranged and meant to protest it. What made Miriam beloved in town was not sweetness alone, though she had that in her, tucked deep and steady, but reliability. People came to her with torn cuffs, loose hinges, and troublesome accounts, because she had a way of setting matters right, without making anyone feel small. When Mrs. Alvarez lost her husband's receipts after a storm tore part of the roof away, it was Miriam who dried each paper by the stove and stitched them into a cloth cover so they would not vanish again. When the schoolhouse coal box cracked, it was Miriam who braced it with scrap oak. When a neighbor's cow wandered into the wash and came back limping, it was Miriam who sat by lantern light mixing comfrey and wrapping the leg while Clara held the bowl. She told her children, again and again, that a person was not measured by what could be purchased new, but by what could be preserved with care. Waste offended her, cruelty offended her more, and boasting offended her most of all. Some things keep breathing after folks stop believing in them, she would say when planting onion sets in tired soil or coaxing light from a warped cupboard door. Our part is to notice. That was the virtue that would save her later, though at the time it seemed merely the plain religion of hands. Then came the years when the weather hardened and men began to talk not about next spring, but about what had once been. Snow melted thin in the high country, the creek narrowed, and the mine up the ridge, which had thrown so much money through town that even the dust seemed ambitious, began to sputter. A few families left quietly. Others borrowed. Harlan Creed did both his best business and his finest smiling in those years. He was a broad man with a polished watch chain and a manner so mannerly it could almost pass for kindness from a distance. His father had kept books before him, and before that another Creed had arrived with little more than a trunk, a talent for signatures, and a nose for other people's need. Harlan extended credit in drought, bought notes in winter, and acquired property in spring. He never raised his voice because paper did the hard work for him. If a man lost a parcel, Harlan called it regrettable. If a widow sold her piano, Harlan called it practical. If children went thin, Harlan said the times were difficult for everyone. Thomas tried to hold against that tide. When freight work slowed, he cut timber higher in the hills. When timber slowed, he took hauling jobs for Creed's warehouse because wages paid in cash had grown scarce. One November afternoon, with the light already paling and frost silvering the wheel ruts, the mule team bolted on an icy grade. The wagon went sideways, timbers shifted, and Thomas was crushed before the other men could get him free. There are losses so large they first arrive as mere confusion. Miriam spent 3 days moving through casseroles, condolences, and hats held low at the door, unable to understand why every object in the house still looked exactly like itself while her whole life had become unrecognizable. Thomas's coat hung on its peg. His shaving cup stood by the wash basin. His boots remained under the bench in a posture of patient return. But the return did not come. She would have endured grief itself, for grief at least is honest, had trouble not begun its practical marching at once. The last timber payment had been delayed. The livery shares Thomas had once hoped to grow were nearly worthless. The note on the house, which had been manageable when work was steady, had already been bought by Harlan Creed. Miriam sold the extra rocker, Thomas's good saddle, and the blue-bordered china her mother had given her. She took in mending until her fingers split. She copied invoices for the schoolmaster at night. Clara left apples on neighbors' steps in exchange for old candles, and Eli gathered fallen twigs as if he meant to prove that diligence alone could substitute for a father. Still the arithmetic would not bend. Harlan allowed one extension, then another, each presented like a favor, each written to his advantage. By late October the wind had sharpened, and he arrived with a clerk and a folded paper. Glancing once at the willow bank behind the house as though it, not Miriam, were the true object of his visit that he told her the matter plainly, which is to say cruelly, though without heat. The note had matured. The property would revert. He needed the house cleared before the first snow because a survey crew would soon inspect the creek lots. She understood then that he had wanted that strip all along, wanted whatever lay under it or beside it more than he had ever wanted his money. She asked for 2 weeks. He granted 3 days. She asked where a woman with 2 children was meant to go in weather like this. He said he was not responsible for Providence. The town watched from porches and windows because everyone in Juniper Crossing owed Harlan something, whether coin or silence, and silence was the cheaper payment. On the morning she left, Clara carried the carpetbag with both hands, Eli dragged a crate of blankets and looked back so often Miriam finally took his face in her palms and turned it toward the road. She locked the door out of habit, though the house was no longer hers, and placed the key on the sill where Thomas had once kept wildflower seeds to DRY the county office, where the stove smoked and the floor smelled of thawing mud. A sheet of delinquent parcels lay weighted by an ink bottle. Miriam had come only to ask after labor or storage, anything that might keep the children under a roof, but her eye fell on a notation in a cramped clerk's hand: 1 cabin, widow's bench, former Voss property, taxes unpaid, structure unsound. Delia Voss she remembered dimly, a county recorder who had once visited the schoolhouse with boxes of old plats and a cough that seemed never to leave her. The woman had died years before, and the cabin, 2 miles above town where the bench began to climb toward scrub pine and open stone, had sat empty since. People said the roof leaked, the stove cracked, and the well had gone bad. No one wanted it. No one, perhaps, but a woman measuring the distance between humiliation and shelter with children at her side. The clerk looked over his glasses and said $2 would clear the tax claim if she wanted the deed entered as is, no guarantees. Miriam felt the stitched coins in her glove like a pulse. Foolish purchases are often only brave ones seen from the wrong window. She paid the $2, signed her name in that neat hand her mother had insisted upon, and walked out with $1.82, an old key, and a folded scrap that said the cabin was hers. The climb to Widow's Bench was harder than the pride it cost. The road thinned to a track, then to memory, and the children tired quickly in the gray light. Juniper Crossing lay below them, smaller with every switchback, its roofs catching the last flat shine of autumn afternoon. When they reached the cabin, it looked less like a house than the idea of one that weather had been trying to erase. The porch listed, one shutter hung by a single leather hinge, and the chimney leaned with the weary stubbornness of the very old. Yet the place sat in a pocket strangely sheltered from the wind, with juniper on one side, a tumble of stone on the other, and a stand of leafless aspens behind it whose pale trunks held the remaining light like candles. Near the foundation, in the cold season of everything, Miriam noticed a band of green. Not much, only a stubborn seam of mint and watercress threading the stones where no green should have been. She knelt and touched the earth. It was damp, even faintly warm. Inside, the cabin held the smell of mouse nests, old soot, and shut-up years, but it was drier than she had feared. The roof needed patching near the west seam. One window was cracked in a clean lightning shape. The stove door sagged, yet the firebox itself looked sound. There was a narrow bedstead, a table with one bitten leg, shelves built by a careful hand, and a trapdoor near the hearth. Half hidden under drifted dust. Eli asked in a whisper whether anyone was still living there. Miriam said not in the way he meant, though even as she answered it she felt that odd frontier sensation, familiar to any of us who have crossed abandoned thresholds, that a room may be empty of bodies and still full of intention. They worked until dark, sweeping, shaking blankets, stuffing rags into cracks, and breaking old chair slats for kindling. When Miriam pried up the trapdoor, a breath of mineral cool air rose from below, carrying the scent of wet stone. The root cellar was shallow, but along one wall sat 3 crocks sealed with wax, a bin of shriveled potatoes from forgotten seasons, and, miracle of miracles, a trickle of water running through a narrow channel cut in rock. Hope, it seemed, had not entirely vacated the place. The first clue came that night while the fire found its draft. As the children drowsed together under quilts near the stove, Miriam was cleaning ash from the hearth with a broken spoon when the metal struck one brick and answered with a hollow note. She rapped again, slower. Hollow. Her father had taught her to listen to wood and wall the way a physician listens to chest and pulse. She fetched the poker, worried loose the brick, then another, and reached into a dark pocket behind the fireback where stone should have continued solid. Her hand touched cold tin. She drew out an old flour canister blackened with soot and bound shut by waxed cord that had been wrapped and rewound with almost ceremonial care. Inside, beneath a layer of oilcloth, lay a small brass key, a packet of papers, and a letter folded around both as if the writer had wanted the words to be the first thing a finder met. The hand was Delia Voss's, crabbed but precise. Miriam knew it at once from the county copies she had once helped sort for the school. The letter was brief, written in ink browned by time. If this is opened, it read, then I pray it is opened by someone with use in her and not greed. Mercy Run was never meant for one man's lock and ledger. The town has been made to forget what belongs to it. The first proof is here. The rest lies where water still speaks under stone. Trust the blue mark. Do not take this to a creed unless you wish it buried again. Miriam read it twice, then a third time, while the cabin snapped softly around her and the children slept. Along with the letter was a hand-drawn scrap of survey, only part of a larger map, showing the bend of a spring line, the outline of Widow's Bench, and a square marked with a small blue X. By morning the cabin had ceased to be only a shelter. It had become a question. Over the next several days Miriam let no hour go idle. She patched the roof with scavenged shingles from an old lean-to collapsed behind the aspens. She reset the stove door with wire. She cleaned the root cellar and found, beneath two worm-eaten shelves, a flat stone painted long ago with a faded streak of blue that nearly vanished unless light struck it sideways. Beneath that stone was a cavity lined with cedar boards, and inside the cavity, wrapped in oilskin and tied with cloth tape, lay the rest of Delia Voss's secret. There were ledgers, copies of deeds, witness statements, and a full survey map bearing the county seal from 23 years earlier. There were also two smaller bundles that caught Miriam harder than the papers did, apple scions packed in damp moss, still pale and living at the tips, and a sack of bean seed marked School Garden, Spring Reserve. The warm seep in the cellar had kept them from dying entirely. It seemed Delia Voss had hidden not only the truth of land and water, but the means of beginning again. The documents told a story beneath the story everyone in Juniper Crossing now lived inside. Long before Harlan Creed wore the chain, before his father Emmett took over the ledgers, the first settlers had set aside Mercy Run, the spring-fed branch of the creek, as a shared watercourse for the town. Delia, then county recorder, had entered the easement herself, water rights for all lot holders, irrigation for the school garden and common plots, no private obstruction beyond the survey stones. But 12 years earlier, after a courthouse fire destroyed several record books, replacement copies had been drafted from surviving notes. In those copies, the communal language vanished. The channel became a boundary, then a private holding attached to parcels later acquired, piece by piece, by the Creed interests. Witness statements in the bundle suggested Delia had discovered the alteration and, fearing the papers would disappear if she challenged the wrong men too soon, hid the originals in her cabin until she could bring them before the district judge. Illness overtook her first. The cabin outlived her. So did the truth. Miriam spread the papers across the table while Clara traced the blue lines with a reverent finger. Mercy Run, according to the survey, rose partly beneath Widow's Bench itself, fed by a spring chamber under the stone shelf of the hill, then ran by Buried Channel toward town, filling a public cistern near the school before emptying into the creek. If the line had been blocked or diverted lower down, then the little warmth under the cabin, the persistent mint, the trickle in the cellar, were not accidents at all. They were remnants of a living source everyone had been taught to forget. Miriam felt something then that grief had not allowed her in months: direction. Not hope exactly, not yet, for hope can be too soft a word when work must still be done, but a hard clear sense that the world contained a seam she could pry open if she kept her nerve. She took the least dangerous papers first to Mr. Sato, the old gardener behind the mission house, who remembered more than people guessed because he listened while others performed. He studied the map, tapped one corner, and said that when he first came to town, there had indeed been a stone cistern near the schoolyard, long since filled. Mrs. Alvarez remembered hauling buckets from a public spout as a girl. Old Pastor Green recalled hearing Delia Voss quarrel with Emmett Creed on the church steps over water turned into paper. Piece by piece, memory began to answer document. But memory, like water, can be frightened back underground. When word drifted, as word always does, that Miriam Holt had found something in the Voss cabin and was asking questions about the creek lots, shutters seemed to close a little earlier. Men who greeted her by name at market turned to their sacks. Women took her hand in passing and said, very softly, "Be careful." Harlan did not wait long. He came up to Widow's Bench in a fine coat unsuited to the mud, his horse stamping among the aspens while he stood on her porch and let his gaze move across the patched roof, the clean window, the children's mittens drying by the door, all the evidence that she had made his cast-off place habitable. He said he admired industry. He said he had heard she was troubled by old papers, and old papers could be troublesome things for a woman alone. Then he offered, in the tone of a man laying down a kindness he expected to be thanked for, to return her former house on favorable terms if she would hand over anything bearing county marks that had turned up in the cabin. He did not ask what she had found, that told her enough. Miriam stood with one hand on the doorframe and said that if the cabin had been nothing but broken chairs and mice, he would not be on Widow's Bench wasting boot leather. His smile thinned. He said the road to the district seat would soon be blocked by snow, and courts moved slowly even in summer. She answered that truth did not stop being true because a road iced over. When he left, he did not slam the gate. Men like Harlan rarely perform their anger so cheaply. They simply begin arranging the consequences. The consequences came by way of pressure rather than spectacle. The mercantile refused her credit for lamp oil. A deputy hinted that her tax deed on the cabin might be defective. Someone cut the line on the small hand sled Clara used to haul wood. The schoolteacher, who had always been kind, advised that perhaps Eli should stay home a while, as tempers in town were unsettled. What weighed on Miriam most was not the malice itself but the old frontier arithmetic of isolation, how quickly a person could be made to feel unreasonable for insisting on what was plain. Yet every evening when she went down into the cellar and heard that thread of water talking under stone, she steadied again. She copied the key documents in triplicate. She hid one set beneath a floorboard, gave one to Mrs. Alvarez, and sent Clara with one sealed packet to Pastor Green, who might lack courage in public but possessed a lockbox no creed could casually open. Then she took Delia's brass key and rode a borrowed mule to the shuttered records shed behind the disused freight office, where an iron chest, long thought jammed, yielded to the key with a shriek of rust. Inside was the ledger Delia had meant to use in court, along with a memorandum signed by 3 founding families and the original town seal pressed in blue wax. Harlan had not merely benefited from an old mistake. His family had built itself upward on a theft. The first snow arrived the night before the town meeting she forced into being. It came thin and dry at first, as if the sky were testing whether the earth deserved a full storm. By morning Juniper Crossing lay under a pale clean sheet, every roofline gentled, every fence post sharpened, the whole town wearing innocence it had not earned. Miriam went down from widow's bench in her father's old coat, the documents wrapped in oilcloth beneath it, Clara and Eli beside her in scarves too short for proper wrapping. People were already gathering at the schoolhouse. Because snow has always made neighbors curious about one another. Harlan stood near the stove, gloved hands folded, confidence arranged around him like polished furniture. He had the county clerk at one shoulder and the deputy at the other. We have all seen such men. They rely less on lies than on exhaustion. They believe ordinary people will choose comfort over truth if the truth asks them to stand too long in the cold. Miriam did not give them that easy choice. She laid the Voss survey on the schoolmaster's desk, then the communal easement, then the witness statements, then the recovered ledger from the iron chest. She read aloud Delia's memorandum in a voice so even that every word struck harder for lack of ornament. She named the courthouse fire. She named the missing language in the replacement records. She named Mercy Run and the public cistern and the school garden and the common plots lost after the creed copies took hold. Then, because paper alone can still be argued with by men who profit from doubt, she asked the room to come outside. They followed her through the snow to the low rise near the schoolyard where Mr. Sato said the old cistern had once stood. Beneath a crust of weeds and drift, near a line of nearly buried stones matching Delia's map, the ground had already softened where warmth rose from below. Men with shovels began almost in spite of themselves. One strike, then another. The soil darkened, the frost gave, and at last the iron lid of the old cistern appeared like a coin in poor light. When they heaved it aside, a breath of damp air rolled up, and a moment later clear water, cold and living, glimmered in the shaft below. Not much, not a roaring salvation, but enough to silence the roomful of doubt that had traveled out into the yard with them. Hope, in towns like that, does not usually arrive with trumpets. It rises in a bucket, in a seed, in a line on a map that refuses to stay dead. What followed moved with the force of permission. Once people saw the water, memory and courage came back together. Mrs. Alvarez spoke of the communal spout her mother had used. Pastor Green admitted he had seen Delia Voss begging witnesses to stand with her and had done nothing. The clerk, sweating now despite the cold, conceded the replacement volumes had been copied under Emmett Creed's supervision. Harlan tried to call for order, then for patience, then for review, but the finest thing about truth finally believed is that it reduces the usefulness of men who have long sold interpretation as if it were law. A district engineer was sent for from Salida. By week's end he confirmed the spring line, the original easement, and the unlawful obstruction farther down where Creed Fencing and Phil had choked the public channel into private use. Harlan lost not only the disputed strip but the authority that had made every prior theft easy. Creditors who had feared him began examining their own papers. Families whose small plots had been pinched by corrections brought forward deeds. His empire did not explode. It shrank, which is often the truer form of judgment. Before winter's middle, he had sold 2 teams, dismissed his clerk, and taken to walking rather than riding, not because the town ruined him by force, but because the town stopped lending him its obedience. Miriam might have kept the spring cabin as her private advantage. No one would have blamed her. She could have charged for access, demanded repayment, bartered the documents into comfort. But she understood that stolen things do not become clean merely because they pass through kinder hands. So she chose the harder righteousness. She gave the original Voss papers to the district court for permanent record and kept only certified copies. She opened the cellar reserve and divided the bean seed between the schoolchildren and the widows on the East Road. Mr. Sato grafted the living apple scions onto hardy rootstock behind the mission, and within 2 years, there were young trees where dust had once been trusted more than the future. The channel from Mercy Run was cleared under common labor, and water returned first to the school cistern, then to the garden plots, then to the trough by the church where even the shyest families could fill pails without bowing to anyone's ledger. Men who had watched her eviction through lace curtains now came up to Widow's bench with boards, glass, lime, and apology disguised as practical help. She accepted what was useful and let the rest fall away. By the time the true deep winter settled over Juniper Crossing, the abandoned cabin no longer looked abandoned. Smoke rose from its chimney in a straight faithful line. The porch had been righted. Clara kept a jar of mint on the windowsill, bright against the snow. Eli set small stones around the spring seam near the foundation as if marking a shrine. And Miriam, who had once stood in the road with nowhere to go, sat at Delia Voss's old table copying the newly restored water charter into a clean ledger for the town, her pen moving steadily while the children breathed in sleep nearby. The house Harlan had thrown her from eventually came back to market, but she did not return to it. Some doors close honestly only once. Widow's Bench, with its hidden water and stubborn green, had chosen her as surely as she had chosen it. So when we think of Miriam Holt, we do not think first of the morning she was cast out, though that is where her story appears to begin. We think of the fact that she was 34 and winter was coming and she still had the discipline to notice what others had passed 100 times without seeing, the warm strip of earth by the stones, the hollow sound behind the hearth, the faded blue mark, the old language buried under newer greed. She had lost her husband, her home, her place in the easy order of town life, and still she did not let bitterness turn her blind. That is the rarer strength. Many people can endure hardship. So when the district examiner arrived 2 days later and temporarily froze certain bank actions, she did not celebrate. She gathered townspeople in the shell of the forge instead, beneath rafters still smelling of old smoke, and unrolled Silas's map across a bench. There, with Dinah reading figures, Mateo marking grades, and Mrs. Kettle spooning stew into bowls for whoever came to work, Eliza explained what her father had prepared. Cold Widow Spring was not a miracle. It was better than that. It was real. The line could be cut in stages before the ground locked hard. A flume section might wait until thaw, but enough water could be brought by ditch and pipe to save stock, school, kitchens, and the lowest orchards if every able hand gave labor instead of suspicion. Some doubted. A few muttered that the whole business was too grand for a woman with soot on her cuffs. Eliza answered by laying the redeemed certificates on the bench, one by one, and saying that Silas Harlan had left those funds not for private comfort but for shared rescue, and that any man unwilling to sweat beside a widow or schoolteacher could stand aside while the rest of Red Wash saved itself. There is a moment in most communities when people either become neighbors again or remain a crowd forever. Red Wash wavered on that edge, then chose. Shovels appeared. Teams were lent. Boys hauled pipe. Dinah organized work tallies so no family's labor went uncounted. Even Reverend Pike, who had once praised Amos from the pulpit for civic prudence, came out with his coat off and blistered his palms in honest embarrassment. The line to Cold Widow Spring was difficult, exactly where Silas had warned it would be. Basalt shelves had to be chipped, then drilled. The ditch grade required more care than brute force. Twice they had cave-ins. Once an early storm buried the upper cut and left everyone gray-faced with fatigue.